Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Printer here. In today's video, we're going to make a very simple Fortnite comparison tool using Flask, Bulma, and the Fortnite Tracker API. So if you're not familiar with Fortnite, it's just a really popular game that's out right now. And this site that I'm looking at here is a site that keeps track of everyone's stats. So I'm going to use the API from here to build a very simple app around. So first thing you need to do if you want to follow along with this is create an account and then go to the API page, and it's going to give you your API key. That is really all you need to get started. It has here the sample API call, which is fairly straightforward. So what I'm going to start off doing is show you how to determine what's in the API and how to use the results of what is returned by the API to actually build an app around. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this URL here. And this API is very simple. It's just one endpoint. So I'll set the URL here. And let's see if I can get that out. I need to save my file as being Flask. So let's see. app.py. So it's a Python file. And I'm going to import requests. So this library allows you to send requests to the API and, of course, get data back from the API. And then next thing I want to do is I want to put my headers down. So I'll show them in this video, but when I post the code, I'll remove them. And you just replace the headers or the key that I'm going to use with your key. So let me go back to the page here. And basically the API is telling you that to authenticate, you need to pass along a header using the format that they have here. So if I put it here, you see that this part is the key that is in the header, and then this is the actual API key. So by key, I mean it's like the name of the header, and then the value of the header is the API key. So to do that, I'll create a dictionary called headers. I'll make the key of that dictionary the header name, and I'll make the value of that header the API key. So just like that. So now I really have both things that I'm interested in. I have both the URL for the API and I have the way to authenticate, which is through the API key header. So one thing I want to change here is I want to change the platform. So I'm just going to be looking at PC users, but you can modify this to look at users on the PlayStation or the Xbox. But for simplicity purposes, I'll be just using PC. And then the nickname is just anyone's nickname. So if you play the game, this will be your nickname. You can also look on the site here and find a nickname. So I'll just pick one. I need to pick one from PC. So let me see who's on PC. PC. Those characters I can't read. So, okay, let's go here. So here's a name. And let me go back to the API. So for now, I'm just going to put that name there. So basically what the API needs is the platform, which I supplied as PC, and then someone's username. So Twitch Swinnos is the username that I'm using for this example right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to call this URL using requests. So if you're not familiar with requests, it's very simple. They want you to do a GET request for this particular API because it's like the world's simplest API. So you're going to write requests, which is what we imported above, and then GET, and then the URL has to be passed in. So URL, which I already have down, and then also the headers. So there is a parameter called headers for GET, and you just pass in the headers dictionary that I just created. And then, of course, this will return something. So let's just call that R. And what I want to do is I want to print what gets returned. So to print the raw text, I'll just type r.text. So this is going to send a request to the Fortnite tracker, and then the results of that request are going to be returned in R. Let's just call this res for response. And then res.text shows me what's in that response. So if I run this app, Python app, we see a bunch of data gets returned. Now, to keep this pretty simple, I'm not going to use most of the data. I'm going to use some simplified data. So basically what I'm looking at here is the match information. So this is for each individual game he's played. But if I scroll up a little bit, so that was recent matches. So lifetime stats is what I'm interested in. So this is basically just like a Python dictionary at this point. It's technically JSON, but it can get converted to a Python dictionary. So what I'm looking for is the key lifetime stats. So instead of text, I'm going to use response to JSON, and I need the parentheses for this, and it's going to convert the JSON data, which is what the API returns, into a combination of Python dictionaries and Python lists. So to get that lifetime stats, I need to reference that key directly because it's now in a Python dictionary. So let me just take lifetime stats and put it here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm only going to print what the lifetime stats are. So if I do Python app again, we see I get far less data, and this data is basically his overall stats since he's played the game. So you see for top 3, it has a value of 1539, so he's finished in the top 3 1,539 times. You can see top 5s, which appears to be wrong. I mean, he has more top 3s than top 5s, which doesn't make any sense. But maybe this is just some archaic data that is no longer used, because I see top 3 with no S at the end, and I see top 3s. So maybe that's what's going on. I'm not 100% sure, but to keep it easy, what I'm going to do is I'm only going to focus on the matches played. So we have the key matches played, we have the key wins, and then we have the key, let's say, kills. So those are the 3 things that I want to focus on and what I'm going to build in this application. But of course, you can use any of these stats if you want to extend it, and you can use any of the other things that are returned by the API as well. So I'm going to need a way to kind of get that information out of the API, because normally the keys and the values will be a little easier to deal with, but this response is a little strange, I have to say, when it comes to APIs, but that's not really a big deal. That can be handled. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function that will basically go through and return the information that I'm interested in, and that is wins, matches played, and kills. So I'm going to assign this result to a temporary dictionary. So the code that I'm writing here is just temporary code that I'll modify as I go on. So I'll just call this temporary. So this is going to be a temporary dictionary. So temporary dictionary. And if I print this, it should be exactly the same thing that I saw. So there are several ways to get the data out of the dictionary, but I'm going to use the most straightforward way. Probably not the final way that I would do it, but it's definitely the easiest way to visualize when you think about it. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through all of the little dictionaries in this list. So you can see here that this is a list, and I'm going to loop through these dictionaries, and if the key matches what I'm interested in, I'm going to add it to some other dictionary. So this temporary dictionary will now be just something blank, and then I'll set this to results. So this is what I'm going to be looping over, and then this temporary dictionary is what I'm going to fill in. So what I need to do is I need to loop over result. So for, let's say, R, for R in result. So for each one of these little dictionaries in the resulting list that I have here, I'm going to compare the key of that. So R key. So R would be an individual dictionary. So each R is going to have a key and a value. So I'm going to say if R key is equal to wins, I'm going to add those wins to the temporary dictionary that I have. So I'll just call this wins, lowercase everything to keep it consistent, and then R value. So if I just try this and then print out the temporary dictionary at the end, let's see what happens. Okay, so we see here the temporary dictionary is telling me that he has this number of wins. So I can pretty much do the same thing for each of the other things that I'm interested in. So if key is equal to kills, then the temporary dictionary is going to be kills equals R value. So remember, we're dealing with the key value from the API. And like I said, this API is a little strange in how it returns the data, but it's still fairly easy to work with. And then the final one that I'm interested in is matches played. So if the key is equal to matches played, then it's going to fill the temporary dictionary. Let's just call this matches with R value. Okay, so if I run this again, I see the information that I'm interested in. So I see the number of kills, I see the number of wins, and I see the number of matches. And like I said, this code here can be simplified in a way, but this is definitely the easiest way to think about it, because for each dictionary in the list, you're thinking, okay, is this dictionary the dictionary for wins? If it is, then set the value of the wins in the temporary dictionary to the value of the value inside of the dictionary returned from the API. I know I'm using the word dictionary a lot, but that's just how you have to think about it. So that's pretty much what I want. So I'll just turn this into a function. So let's say I'll call this populate player data, and it's going to take in some list. So like result, I'll call this API data. And then I will indent everything that I have here. And then I'll replace the necessary parts. So result needs to be the API data, because that's going to be passed into the function. And then for this, I'll just call this, it can remain R. Yeah, let's just keep it R. And then instead of printing the temporary dictionary at the end, I'm going to return it. So that's pretty much my function there. So now if I do this, so print populate player data, and then I pass in results. So this is from the API result, and I pass it into populate player data, it should return this temporary dictionary. And I need to put the temporary dictionary in here. So let me just move that into the function. Okay, so now let's take a look and see if it returns the exact same thing. It does, and of course, if I break it intentionally, then it will complain. So we know that it's actually calling the function. Okay, so now that I have this part done, I can actually get started on the Flask app. So what I'll do is around this, I'll fill in the part for Flask. So I'm going to say from Flask, import Flask, render templates, and I'll need requests. I know that for sure. I'll probably need some other things. I'll leave URL and headers up here. And this is going to be changed to be dynamic, but for now, I'll leave this as Twitch Swinnos. And then I'll comment this out because this is going to go in one of our routes along with this. So I'll move that there. And then I'll do the typical stuff for Flask. So I'll say app equals Flask __ name. And at the bottom, for simplicity, yeah, I can do this. So if name is main, then I'm going to run the app in debug mode. Okay, so I don't need this print statement anymore, so I'll comment that out. And now the next thing I'll need is a route that handles this so we can actually see what's going on. So app route, and it's just going to be on the index, and I'll call this index, and I'll return a template. So render template index.html, which I need to create right now. Okay, so I have an index.html file, and that is going to get rendered. So just to test to make sure, let's call this Fortnite comparison. If I run the Flask app and go to localhost port 5000, then I should see a blank page, but it has the header. Okay, so it tells me template not found. That's because I did not save my template in the right spot. So I'll just resave this. I'll create a new directory. I'll call it templates. So Flask knows where to look for my template, and I'll save it there. And then I'll refresh, and hopefully I see a blank page when this loads. And my server is really slow right now, but probably can't see it in the video, but at the top, I see Fortnite comparison at the top. So I know it's loading the template that I have here. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is I want to start thinking about what it's going to look like. And to make it look a certain way, I'm going to use a CSS framework called Bulma. So Bulma is kind of similar to Bootstrap or Foundation if you've used those. It's just another CSS framework. I like it because I find it to be pretty simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to copy elements from the documentation and then modify them to look a certain way. So the first thing I need to do is actually add it to my index file. So you can use npm to install it, but instead of that, I'm just going to use the CDN. So I'm going to get the minimized version of it and get the link tag, and it's going to copy that to my clipboard. And I can simply put it here in the head of my HTML document. And I may need to add some things for the viewport. So let me see. Yeah, so the doc type has to be HTML5, and then I need to add the responsive viewport meta tag. So I'll just take that and I'll add it in here. So I'll just put this under there, and let me just make sure it doesn't require anything else. Looking at it, I don't think so. So if I just take the hello world example that they have here and I put it inside of my body with the Bulma library being imported here in the head, I should be able to see something. Okay, so you see this is styled correctly, so I know that I have Bulma there. If I were to take out the link, you'll see that it becomes much uglier, which it does. So I know that it's working correctly. So I don't need this part anymore because I won't be using it. So what I want to do now is I want to find some things that I can add to my page to make it look nice. So I'll start with a hero section. So a hero section is the top part of a page that kind of tells you what the page is about in a sense. So if I go to, I believe, layout, and I go to hero, you can see the examples here. So these things that are in the yellow borders are heroes. So you see you can have a hero of different colors and of different sizes. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first one. Let's take the one that's primary color. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to put it here. And then when I refresh my app, we see that I have the hero section there. So I want to modify this slightly to reflect my app. So I'll call the title Fortnite Comparison. And then for the subtitle, I'll say compare the stats of 2 players. Okay, so that's how our app is going to work. And you see, by just making those 2 changes, I get the result that I have there. So it already looks good, even though I've barely done anything. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a way for the user to type in a name and search for that name to add it to the comparison. So the way it's going to work is the user is going to search for 2 names, and then those 2 players will be compared against each other in a sense. You'll see their stats side by side. So to do that, I'm going to go to the form section because I want an input. So I'll click on form here, and I just want an input that goes across the page and has a button attached to the end of it. So that's just what I'm looking for here. So you see all the types of inputs, but this kind of input is really the one that I want, the one that has form, that says form add-on. So let me just see if there are any others that are what I want, and if there aren't, so kind of like that, but yeah, it's going to be kind of like that. So let's just use that one. So I'm going to take this div and I'm going to put it inside of my code here. So if I just add that and refresh, we see it gets added there, but it's pretty ugly how it looks, like it's right up next to the hero. So to overcome that, what I'm going to use is something called a section. So I'll go back to the layout part and I'll go to section. And what section does, it's going to put some space in between sections. So this is vertical space. So we're going to have the hero first and then followed by another section, which is going to hold this input that I'm going to make. So I'm just going to copy this, and you may notice that there's a container inside of here, and the container just kind of centers everything. So I'll leave the container, and I'll take the div that I copied for the input, and I'll place it inside of the container. Okay, so it's pretty ugly, the formatting, but it still works. Okay, so we see here now that we have a search bar, and then we have the search. And just to make everything consistent, you know what, I'm going to make the hero inside of a container as well. So if I just put div container there and close out the div, we'll see that the hero section will shrink. No, it didn't. I need to add it outside. So outside, actually, no. I'm not completely sure, but I'm not going to waste too much time on this because it's a minor part of the page. This being centered is more what I want, so I'll just leave it like that. So now what I'll do is I'll change the placeholder text to be something that is a little more descriptive. So I'll just say player name for the placeholder. So player name is going to be the placeholder. So when I refresh, I see the player name is there as a placeholder, and I already know that this button is going to be an actual button and not a link. And a little bit later, I'm going to make this to where it is a form, because right now it's just an input and a button and they don't have a form associated with it, but that is what I'll be doing next. Well, after this next section. So now what I want to do is I want to add in the part that's actually going to compare the stats. So I'll start off by adding another section. So I'll just copy this and paste it here. And then I can get rid of what's inside the section because I'm going to replace it with something. And that something is tiles. So tiles are just these things here. For my particular case, I want to use 2 tiles, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the stats of one player in one tile and the stats of another player in the other tile, and they'll be different colors so it's easy to see. So if I just copy the example that they have here, I can put it into my code and I'll be able to modify it. So first, this is what it looks like when I just copy and paste it, but I want to get rid of pretty much all these tiles except for 2. So I'll slowly remove some of them, just so I don't get confused. So I want to remove the tall tile. So I'll save that. And let's see. We see that the tall tile is gone. I see that it's not going all the way across the page. That's because there's this is8 thing here, which means that the group of tiles will take up 8 columns instead of the full 12. So I can just remove that class and it's going to put everything in the full space, so the full 12 columns inside of the container. So I want to get rid of the wide tile now. So let me just find where wide tile is, and I'll get rid of the div. So we see that that disappears, and I'm getting closer. So we see that there's a middle tile. I'll leave the middle tile because I want them to be next to each other, but I do want to get rid of the bottom tile. So I'll save it like that. And we see now I have 2 tiles, and then this middle one has an image in it. So I'll simply get rid of the image. And now we have 2 tiles. And they only take up as much vertical space as they need. So the reason why they shrunk is because by taking out the image, it no longer needed all that extra vertical space. So now what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to put some text in here to give us something that looks kind of nice. So we see that there's a title and a subtitle here. So for the title, I'm going to have like the, let's say the player name. For the subtitle, I'm going to have wins. And let's just put a placeholder there, 1, 2, 3. And then I'll put the other stats below it. So wins, matches, and kills. Okay, so if I refresh that, I see the player name, I see the number of wins, I see the matches, and I see the kills. And let me make this red because I don't want this to match my hero. So I'll go here to is primary, and I'll change that to is danger. Danger is red. Okay, so now that I have the red one, I'm pretty much going to do the same thing for the other tile. So it's going to have the same information. I can pretty much just copy it and paste it. And instead of player name, I'll just put player 2 name. So this is pretty much it. This is what I want my app to look like. I know it's not very complicated, but it's a way to demonstrate what's going on. So now I need to add the dynamic part to this. So the first thing I'll do is I will return some data that doesn't come from the API quite yet, but I'll return it so we can just see how this data can be used inside of the template. So I'll go back to my app, and inside of the index, I'm going to pass, let's say, 4 things to the template. The first thing I want is the name of player 1. The second thing is the name of player 2. And then the third is the stats for player 1. And the fourth is the stats for player 2. So I'll just initialize everything. So player 1, it's Anthony. Player 2, let's just use my last name, Herbert. Player 1 stats is what I'll call this, not status, but stats. I'll have wins, let's say 343, kills 392, and matches as 2,933. And I'll do the same thing for player 2. So player 2 stats, same thing. So if you notice, this dictionary that I'm building is exactly the dictionary that I'll get when I use my populate player data. And I'm doing that on purpose because I am expecting to get that data returned eventually when I actually call the API. But for now, I'll just use dummy data. So 232 kills will be, let's say, 23,000. And matches will be just like that. Okay. So that's all the data that I have. So let me just return everything. Player 1 equals player 1. And it's not too much, so I can keep it up on one line. Actually, it is starting to get to be a bit much. So player 1 stats is player 1 stats, and player 2 stats is equal to player 2 stats. Okay, so now I have this data being sent over to my template. So now I want to display it. So what I'll do here is I will use the brackets in Jinja so I can replace the value. So for example, if I put player 2 here and I refresh the page, I should see Herbert there because that's the name of player 2, right? And then I'll do the same thing for player 1. And I should see the actual name. Okay. And then I'll do the same thing for wins, matches, and kills. So basically, I just need to reference the dictionary. So player 1 stats, wins. Just like that. So if I just copy this and paste it, it's pretty much the same data over and over again, except, or the same thing over and over again, except for the key. So kills, matches, kills, matches. Okay, so there we go. Now when I refresh this, I should see the data that I put in my app.py file. So we see it all here. Actually, I forgot to use player 2 for these. So this should be player 2 instead of player 1. And I'll put that there. Okay, so we're getting closer to the end result. So now the next thing that I want to do is I basically want to put if statements around the tile just to make sure that I have information for that player. So basically, if the player exists, show the tile. If the player doesn't exist, then don't show the tile. So to do that, I'll go back to my HTML. And I know it's pretty ugly. I was thinking of using a different editor for this one, but this one's fine. So let's see where, I think right here is where I want it. So basically I'm going to say if player one, so basically if player one actually exists, then I want to show everything in that tile. So I can end if there, and then I'll do the same thing for the other tile. So if player two, then show that tile. So that shouldn't have made any changes because I have both player one and player two. But if I change one of them to none, let's try Anthony first. If I change it to none, that means that player no longer exists. So we see Anthony goes away. And if I change this to none, then it should be the opposite. Herbert goes away. And that's exactly what I want. If I wanted, I can make these the same size, but for simplicity purposes, I'll just let them fill the entire page at first, and then you can search for a second player. So with that, I think that's going to be pretty much everything for the template in terms of, how it looks in certain situations. So now what I need to do is I need to create a form for the index. So I'll put the form in here. So let's see, where's that input that I have? So I'm just going to put a form tag. So form method is going to be equal to post because I'll be posting this. And by the way, this is just going to be a single page. It's going to be a pretty clumsy way of doing it, but of course this could always be expanded to use multiple pages or just multiple endpoints in general. But just to keep things simple, I'm going to use a single page. So this is now a form. And basically what I want to do is whenever they hit the search button, it's going to search for the player name. So I need to give this input a name. So I'll call this name player name. And what I'll do here in my route is I'll make sure that this accepts both GET requests and POST requests. And what I'll do is I'll say if it's a POST request, I'll do one thing, and if it's a GET request, I'll do something else. So if request method is equal to POST, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply print requests, form, GET, and then player name. And if I see that player name, then I know it's working correctly. And then it's going to fall out of this if block and just return the template again. So I'll refresh this. And hopefully it works the first time. Okay, so I'm going to type in a name. Let's just type in Anthony. And what I'm expecting to see here is Anthony when I hit search. So I hit search and I see Anthony there. So I know I'm getting the data back correctly. So basically, this is where you type in a username that is associated with Fortnite, and it's going to eventually search the API. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to search for that player in the API. So let me get my URL again. And this time what I'm going to do is instead of hard coding the name, I'm going to put this little placeholder there. And then I'm going to perform that GET request again. So on post, meaning whenever they submit the form, that's when I'm searching, not when they simply load the page. So I'll give this variable player1 equals request form GET and then player name. Okay, so I can comment this out, or I'll just get rid of it completely. So player1 is equal to the data from the form. So once I have player one, I'm going to get the data from the API. So requests, get URL, and I need to format that with the name of player one because I added that placeholder. and then I want to pass along the headers that I created. And I can take this and I can directly pass it to the function that I created, or I can assign this to a variable. We'll just say player 1 results. And then what I'll do is I will call populate player data, pass in player 1 result, because remember it takes in the API data, and it's going to end up with player 1 stats. Okay, so now I can just simply remove this hard-coded data and use it that way. And then once I have player 1 stats, it's going to fall out of the if block and then load those stats into the template. So let's give that a shot. So once again, my server is pretty slow for some reason. I don't know why. It's just my computer right now. But once it reloads, let me just close it out and then restart. So once the page loads, I'm going to search for a user. I'll just use the same user. So let me copy his name. And I expect to see his stats. So if I hit search, it gives me an error. So it tells me byte indices must be integers or slices, not str. So I'm not quite sure what that means. So basically what I'll do is I will go to where the error is. So I see the error occurs on line 33. And it's because the data passed in isn't quite correct. And I remember now that I use .json. So that's the data that I need to pass in. And then I also need to pass in lifetime stats as well. So if I have the example here, lifetime stats, I can pass it there. And let's give it another shot. So it should restart it for me. I'll refresh the page and move this over. Okay, so I'll paste in his name again. In search. Okay, so I see that his stats have populated. His name is there. The number of wins that he has is there. The matches played and the kills. So let's compare that with what we have here. So if you look on the right-hand side here, you get his lifetime stats. So the kills are 19,338. And we see that here, 19,338. He has, let's see, where are our wins? 1,521 wins, which I see that in the matches, 3,188. So we know it's pulling back the correct data from the API using whoever I searched with. To just prove that this is the case, what I'll do is I'll find another PC user. So let's use Hamlin's and search. And we see Hamlin's appears there. It says he has 1,103 wins. And here it says the same thing, and it will say the same thing for matches played and kills. So the final thing that I want to do is I want to make this a true comparison. So I'm going to remove the information for player 2 and set this to none. And also for player 1, I can set it to none. So when I load the page initially, I get nothing. So let me just demonstrate that. So I perform a GET request on the index, and that is going to return the page. And since neither user or neither player is defined, it returns nothing. But if I put Hamlin's in again and search, then it will show me Hamlin's alone. Now what I want to do is I want to make sure that I can use both player 1 and player 2 at the same time. And a way that I did it, probably not the best way, definitely not the best way, but I used a hidden input here. So the hidden input just means like there's going to be some data that is passed with the form, but the user doesn't type in themselves. So input type hidden. I'll give this name player 1 name. And then the value is going to be, let's say, if player 1 player 1. So what this is doing is it's saying that if player 1 exists, so the user's already searched for a player, then it's going to populate that player into the hidden field. So when the page gets to this state, it's going to be embedded in the form. So when you search again, that initial player, player 1, is going to be passed along with the second player that you're searching for. So to use this, I just need to cover both cases. So in the case where player 1 exists already, then you're basically going to perform the request on player 2. Well, you're going to assign the variable to player 2 and then perform the request on both. So what I mean by that is basically, okay, so we have player 1 here. So instead of using player name to begin with, I'm going to use that player 1 name. And if player 1 name has a value, it's going to get passed into player 1. If it doesn't, then this will be empty and it will evaluate to false. So what I'll do is I'll say if player 1, so if player 1 actually exists, so the person using the app has searched for someone already, then that person is going to get saved into player 1. So that means that player 2 needs to be populated with the input from the form. So I'll say player 2 is equal to request form gets, and then player name, because that's the name of the input that actually the user types into. And in the other case where player 1 hasn't been found yet, then we know the user is searching for the first time. So player 1 is going to be equal to request form get player name. Okay, so it's the same thing. I can simplify that, but I'll just move on from that. But it should be pretty obvious how to simplify that. Okay, so now that I have both player 1 and player 2, I can think about performing the request. So I already have the request for player 1, so I'll just leave that as it is. And for player 2, I'm going to perform that request if player 2 actually exists. So I'll say if player 2, then pretty much do the same thing that I did for player 1, but with player 2. So I'll copy that, I'll paste it, and then what I'll do is I'll simply update the variables to be player 2 instead of player 1. So player 2 results, it's going to take in player 2 as the username. The headers are going to be exactly the same, and the lifetime stats part is going to be the same. And then player 2 stats, and it's going to populate from player 2 result. Okay, so that's pretty much it. And all that information is going to fall out of the if block and get passed to my template. So I'll save and I'll restart my app. And I'll search for the first player, so Hamlin's. I think in Z. So I see Hamlin's, and then I'll search for another player. And remember, it's PC only because of what I did in the URL for the API, but of course it can be any other platform. So what's an easy one to type in? TSM_myth. Okay, so TSM_myth. I can search and I see the stats for myth. So we see that their wins are being compared. So Hamlin's has 1,103, myth has 1,354. You see their matches are different, and you see the kills are different. So this is basically the app that I wanted to build. Of course, this can be expanded by quite a bit. You can do a lot of error checking with this as well. If you enter a name that doesn't exist, and it's going to error out for you. Of course, that's not desirable in a real app. But for demonstration purposes, I just cover the happy case, because adding all the extra stuff is what really takes the most time when you're developing an app. But for these videos, at least, I want to showcase the actual functionality that we're interested in. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you have any questions on using this API or using it with Flask or Bulma, you can just let me know in the comments down below. If you ever make any modifications to this and you make it better, let me know. I would love to take a look at it. You're free to use my code as a base. And that's pretty much it. So if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. And that's about it. So thanks for watching. I will talk to you next time.